We all know by now that Concord was a massive disaster for Sony. The game took 8 years to develop and failed in just 8 days. There has not been a more tragic death of a game than this one in modern times. But there is more to this story than what we might have thought. Colin, who was a game reporter, who is not really into the scene much these days, spoke about what went on the development side of Concord in his podcast, Sacred Symbols. This right here is what he posted from his podcast on Twitter. The first thing he says is that he was wrong about his estimation of the budget of Concord.
The reason that I wanted to talk about it is because some of the assumptions that I had made about the game were dead wrong, as far as how much it cost and how much Sony really lost on it.
Now hearing this, I was like, okay, so it was less. It was not that big of a disaster. They can write it off with like a $500 collector's edition of Spider-Man 3 or whatever. But then he said,
so the big thing that you really need to know here about this is that Concord cost about $400 million to make.
Wait. You guys heard it too, right? It was not just me. 400 million. What could they have possibly spent it on? Did they invite Abraham Lincoln back from the dead to be part of this game? Oh wait, they have like a 2-hour-long credit roll, so that explains it.
The story goes that Concord, by the time Concord was, so in the first quarter of 2023, Concord had basically entered an alpha state. This was before Sony had even purchased the team, but Sony had been working with Probably Monsters, and which was the original owner of Firewalk and Firewalk, probably since late 2020, maybe 2021 at the latest on Concord. The game was in development before that. Up to the point that the game went into alpha state, they had already spent about $200 million on it. And it's unclear how much of that money is from Probably Monsters and the original investors into the game and how much of that money was from Sony.
So Monster bought Fireworks Studios and sold it to Sony. Fireworks Studios was already developing Concord even before all of that. Rumor has it that the execs at Fireworks Studios said that this game, Concord, could be the best live service game ever and that they could get infinite money from it by releasing new skins, new characters, expansions, etc. I don't know how much of that is true, but two investors agreed on a deal and spent $200 million even before it was announced. So something might have excited them, right?
There's this term in product development, not only with games, but really with everything. You can like manufacture a tchotchke. You guys might have heard of it. It's called minimum viability, or a minimum viable product. Mm-hmm. The idea behind this, or MVP, the idea behind this is that this is like what you're trying to achieve. And it's like, once you cross this barrier, you feel comfortable selling it. It's not that it's the best it can be, or that it's what it's going to be by the time you launch it, because there's all sorts of extra stuff you do to it. But like, this is the minimum viability of the product. When the game had already had $200 million spent on it and was basically in an alpha form in quarter one of 2023, from that point until the game launched, Sony spent another $200 million on it. The scuttlebutt behind the scenes about Concord is that the game was in a laughable shape when it was shown, and ready, basically like when the alpha was ready to go and they were kind of being like, we're ready to kind of get moving towards getting this thing out in the next year or two. It was in such horrible shape that Sony felt like they needed to spend that much money again. So, 200 plus 200 to get the game to the MVP status, not to the status of it being like a great game, to get it to just viability.
Whoa, so you're telling me that Concord had an even worse state than what it was released in, and they were almost getting ready to sell that product? I would have loved to seen it. But what I don't get is, if it was in a laughable state, what was the $200 million spent on? Clearly not on marketing, as the product was not even announced yet. And not learning from what happened before, Sony decided to dump another $200 million, thinking that it would bring in billions. First off, Black Myth Wukong was reportedly made on a budget of $70 million. That game was stunning and had tons and tons of innovation. This game looked and felt like an Overwatch clone. $200 million for that is crazy. Oh wait, now I know why the PS5 Pro is $700. They need to get their money back somehow.
A major expense was having to urgently outsource much of the game to other studios to finish building the game out. And that two fundamental things were not worked on at all up to the point in which the game was shown in alpha. Onboarding, nothing about that. No, like there was nothing about how players get on, like how they make their character, all that kind of stuff, or, choose their character and get there. And monetization. to very expensive, very specific and boutique things that happen to games like this.
Maybe the execs that signed off the deal to buy the studio were playing a prank on Sony. The game was not finished and the other studios were called upon to make their game. And monetization was not built, which was the whole point of a live service game. Now I am really curious as to what was shown to Sony and Monster to make them buy the company.
But that the game cost about $400 million to make, soup to nuts. Sony put most of that money in, and it is not only so, because we had kind of said like this must be Sony's biggest loss ever on a game, and it is. It's the biggest game Sony's ever released from a budgetary standpoint from the first party or second party. So let that sink in.
It's crazy.
And it's totally unintuitive. There are games that are in development right now at Sony first and second party that are more expensive than this. But as of the games that have come out so far, so think about like Spider-Man 2 and so on and so forth. We know The Last of Us Part 2 cost $220 million. Spider-Man 3 is going to cost about $350 million. This game cost more than that. And they lost all of it because they made no money. They made about $1 million gross revenue, and then they gave it all back. So this is a huge, multiple hundreds of millions of dollar loss.
I have no words now. Now I actually feel bad for Sony because they must have lost almost all of the profits they made from Spider-Man 2 and The Last of Us 2 with this one.
Now the question is, why? Why did this happen? This game was heavily championed behind the scenes. Now we know this because Sony ended up, what's funny is that the game is presented in Q1 2023 as this, we're kind of getting towards the end. The game is nowhere near being done. It's in a horrible position. And then Sony buys the team. The idea behind this was, and the term apparently verbatim had been used, that Concord is the future of PlayStation. That they had such major ambition for this game that it was referred to internally as a Star Wars-like project for Sony. That it can be repeatedly revisited over and over and over again, not only in cross media, but in what we were seeing. We've already kind of seen little bits of it. So the weekly story vignettes that they were going to release, and then of course the inclusion in Amazon's Secret Levels anthology, that's like just scratching the surface of it.
Oops, I got my answer. They sold it as the next Star Wars for Sony. No wonder they jumped on it. Deals with Amazon even before release, multiple weekly animated videos. Well, we already knew about that one, but still it's crazy to call it Star Wars for Sony because no one that I know of said anything remotely as good for the game.
A major thing about the game is that there was, and I think we can kind of get this vibe from just the nature of the people making it and kind of the way the game reads and all that, a toxic positivity vibe. You weren't allowed to say anything, apparently internally, about this game. About how like something's wrong with it, character designs are not right, and so on and so forth. They really, truly believe this was Herman Hulst's baby, apparently. And he internally was himself a massive champion of the game.
Herman Hulst is the CEO of Sony, by the way, so that's why it came out the way it did. Obviously, the only thing Herman would see is how to make the dollar. But if it was discouraged to even speak badly about any of the flaws of the game, it was bound to fail. Nothing could be improved if all the suggestions get suppressed because of the fear of their boss.
When people were like, Concord lost $200 million. Now, people were pulling that money out because that's basically how much like some of the first party games like Ghost of Tsushima, The Last of Us Part 2, etc. kind of cost in that frame. And I was like, there's no way that it costs that much. I was saying like it cost 9 figures probably, like low $100 million, but there's no way it cost $200 million. No, it cost $400 million. So, and I am totally solid on this source, by the way. So that's why I'm willing to share it with you. Because again, I'm not really a journalist. So yeah, the big things to take away, $400 million loss. The game was in horrible shape as of 18 months ago before release. Not even monetization, no onboarding, most content not even there. The game was in such bad shape at that point that they spent the budget of it again in urgent outsourcing to get the game finished from all of these different angles over an 18-month period. Internally, the game was considered part of the future of PlayStation with heavy cross-media references and a system of toxic positivity surrounding it that didn't allow anyone to meaningfully change the course of the game. Because if the people at the top truly believe in something, you you're not going to be able to do much about that, I don't think, from the trenches.
No one would have thought that Concord would cost $400 million. Ghost of Tsushima and the others he mentioned were fantastic looking single player games with large maps and so much going on. Sure, running the servers would have eventually made this game more expensive than those big single player games, but it only ran for 8 days. Well folks, now there we have it. This was a good insight on how the team thought about this project. The higher ups saw the potential in making so much money with it that they thought that it was their Star Wars. It was basically their infinite money glitch, but some of the devs knew about how bad it was turning out to be. If the information said in this video are true, then those devs were not even allowed to speak because of the fear of upsetting the execs, the champions as they call it. The signs were there from the start when they bought an unfinished game that was barely a product, and to think that this could become their version of Star Wars was crazy. I mean, when games like Last of Us was completed with a budget of $200 to $250 million, Concord took $400 million, and for what? The game mechanics was nothing new. It was basically a copy of Overwatch. It already was expensive before Sony bought the company Fireworks, and they still thought this would be the best thing they ever made. Well, maybe Sony learned its lesson to not have their hopes high with such low effort games. Or maybe they are expecting way too much with their new multiplayer Horizon game, but we will have to wait and find out. But if you want a quick overview on what's going on with Dragon Age the Veilguard, you can watch this video. See you in the next one.